Hi guys, I'm just going to re-record this whole thing because the live version we did yesterday got a little bit confused. And so if you're just joining us via the internet, I look like a genius because this second take is the only one you're seeing. The Vision and the Voice, Libra 418, is loaded with Bible verses, Bible references, I should say. And the three main groupings are references to the book of Genesis, references to the Gospels, and references to Revelation. There are other ones as well, but I think those are the biggest chunks. I'm going to omit entirely the references to the Gospel because the references to the Gospel, I think, are opaque and a little bit bratty. It's just accusing Christ of being a vampire, and it's difficult to understand unless you have a little bit of Nietzsche or have been to other places in Crowley where he talks about Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity. And I think it's good. I think it's useful to understand. But I only want to read from the Bible and from Libra 418 today. I didn't want to get too complicated. So we're going to focus on Genesis today, where there actually is some attempt to explain, although it's also opaque, but to explain a little bit of what the nature of the criticism actually is. And then in a subsequent video we'll focus on the Revelation, where the same kind of criticism and revision is made, and in a slightly more helpful way than the criticism of the Gospel. I have notes on my phone, so you're going to have to bear with me while I flip through my phone a little bit. But here we are in the 30th Aether. In my volume, it's page 5, paragraph 5 through 11. Rend your garments, O ye clouds, uncover yourselves for the love of my Son. Who are they that trouble thee? Who are they that slew thee, O light? Come thou who art joined with me to bruise the dragon's head. We who are wedded the earth, and the earth perceive it not. Oh, that our beds were seen of men, that they might rejoice in my fertility, that my sister might partake of my great light. And in the same Aether, page 6, paragraph 9, O Savior of the world, bruise thou my head with thy foot to save the world, that once again I touch him whom I slew, that in my death I feel the radiance and the heat of the moving of thy robes. In the Revelation, we learn that the dragon is also Satan and that old snake, the snake of Genesis. And so the reference here is to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, well, I think 14 and 15. And the Lord said unto the serpent, Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed, and it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. So, it shall bruise thy head. The woman shall bruise the serpent's. I keep getting this wrong. The serpent shall bruise the woman's head, and the woman shall bruise the serpent's heel, which is a little bit weird, since the serpent just got its legs taken away, and so neither does it have a heel, nor can it reach the woman's head, because it's down there eating dust all the days of its life. And here, in 418, it talks about bruises on the head, the dragon being bruised on the head, so that's a little bit different. It should be the woman who's bruised on the head. I gather that in the Hebrew, this is a bit confusing, and it is sometimes translated as the serpent being bruised on the head and the woman being bruised on the heel, which makes a good deal more sense just from a logistical perspective. But there's an identity in Thelema between Christ and Satan. Not a direct identity, but I think in Wake World, I think it's Lucifer that is secretly Jesus, who is the Savior of the world. No, secretly Yeshua. Lucifer is secretly Jesus, who is the Savior of the world, and Yeshua is secretly Satan, who is the Savior of the world. So there's kind of a circle, a rough identity between these figures, although the criticisms of Christ still stand. And I don't know, bruise on the head might have to do with the crown of thorns, but just notice this, that the bruise on the head, which is supposed to be a curse, a punishment for facilitating or instigating the fall of man, is seen here as being the inciting incident, the thing that saves the world. So that's worth noting. My comments here are extemporaneous. For the most part, I have some idea of what I want to say, but I think the most important thing is just to understand that these verses correspond. So my interpretation, you can take it or leave it, but drawing the reference from Liber 418 to the more biblical stuff is, I think, the meat of this conversation. Now we're looking at the 28th Aether, page 14, paragraph 3. But now, if the sun arise, fold thou thine arms, then shall God smite thee into a pillar of salt. And the biblical reference is from Genesis 19, verse 26. And this is because there are not 5 good men in Sodom, only Lot is a good man. So if there were 5 good men in Sodom, then God would have destroyed the city, would not have destroyed the city, would have spared the city. But because there's no one but Lot is instructed to take his wife and his children and to leave and not to look back. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. So here's the difference in, again in Liber 418, but now if the sun arise, fold thine arms, and then shall God smite thee into a pillar of salt. A pillar of salt in this is fixed and focused, and is going to be able to endure the dispersion of Choronzon. Excuse me. Is going to be able to endure the dispersion of the demon sea. And so, and remember that the reward of this ordeal is that you get to become a little pile of salt, a little pile of dust, excuse me, in the city of the pyramids. So a pillar of salt, the symbolism is not that far removed. I mean, I don't understand it fully. I don't know why. Usually the reversals here elucidate something about the biblical text. So when we see the pillar of salt as a reward in Liber 418, we should be looking for the way that it's also a reward for Lot's wife, and that's the part that I can't understand. Now we skip all the way to the 19th Aether. page 47 in my text, and 47 and 48 in its entirety I can read. At first there is a black web over the face of the stone. A ray of light pierces it from behind and above, and then cometh a black cross reaching across the whole stone, and then a golden cross, not so large, and there is a writing in an arch that spans the cross in an alphabet in which the letters are all formed of little daggers, cross-hilted, differently angled, and the writing is, worship in the body the things of the body, and worship in the mind the things of the mind, and worship in the spirit the things of the spirit. This is going to be a thelemic reformation of Jesus' commandment to render unto God the things of God and render unto Caesar the things of Caesar, or something like this. And it's, for Jesus, it's a negotiation. It's the way in which Jews can be both citizens of the empire and practice their faith by devoting themselves in the appropriate way to their spiritual concerns and to their civil concerns. Later on in the Gospel of John, that's going to seem, and then in the Revelation of John even more, that's going to seem less appropriate. But here, for the Thelemite, what it means is you don't have to do renunciation and abstain from sex or from a social life or take a vow of poverty. You can worship in the body the things of the body, worship in the mind the things of the mind, and worship in the spirit the things of the spirit. Notice it doesn't say anything about a civil responsibility. This is mainly about conducting yourself in the context of yourself. Talking about the alphabet of daggers. The holy alphabet must be written by sinners, that is, by those who are impure. Impure means those whose every thought is followed by another thought, or who confuse the higher and the lower, the substance with the shadow. Every aether is truth, though it be but a shadow, for the shadow of a man is not the shadow of an ape. Note, all this comes to me without voice, without vision, without thought. This is a different definition of sin than we have in the book of the law, where the word of sin is restriction. Here, there's actually a definition of or a defense of the principle of identity, where, if your thought is followed by another thought, even though, we may look different as a young teenager than we do as an old man, and maybe all of our cells have been replaced, so there's none of the same physical material, and our opinions on everything are different, but as long as there's a continuity of thought, we can call that the same person. And the refute to this is like, what about a really deep sleep, or a coma, or some sort of crisis where someone experiences very briefly temporary brain death or something? That would be an interruption in the chain of thought. But we still want to call that the same person after they, wake up from a confusing dream that seems to be disconnected from the chain of thought. And here, even more, holding on to this principle of identity is sin. And this is because in the larger context of the book, what we want to do is abandon the principle of identity entirely. What we want to do is give ourselves up to Babylon. The demon sea is going to be pulling us in all sorts of directions by showing us temptations and different thoughts, and trying to teach us things or tell us amusing stories, but all of his temptations lead us nowhere. It's simply dispersion. And so what we want to be is like the pillar of salt, non-identified with ourselves and only willing to let go into the mind of Babylon, the master of the temple doesn't exist. So that's why this is sin, and why the alphabet of daggers can only be written by sinners. Also, we'll read it in Genesis before I say that. The showstone is pressed upon my forehead and causes intense pain. As I go on from Aether to Aether, it seems more difficult to open the Aether. The golden cross has become a little narrow door, and an old man like the hermit of the tarot has opened it and come out, and I ask him for admission, and he shakes his head kindly and says, "It is not given to flesh and blood to unveil the mysteries of the Aether, for therein are chariots of fire and a tumult of horsemen, whoso entereth here may never look on life with equal eyes again. I insist." The little gate is guarded by a great green dragon. Remember, the dragon is both the serpent and Satan. And now the whole wall is suddenly fallen away, and there is a blaze of chariots and of horsemen, and a furious battle is raging, and one hears nothing but the clash of steel, and the neighing of chargers, and the shrieking of the wounded. 1,000 fall at every encounter, and are trampled underfoot, yet the Aether is always full. There are infinite reserves. No, that is all wrong. For this is not a battle between two forces, but a melee in which each warrior fights for himself against all the others. I cannot see one who has even one ally, and the least fortunate who fall the soonest are those in the chariots, for as soon as they are engaged in fighting, their own charioteers stab them in the back. I'm put in mind of, I think it's the Lockean version, maybe. Oh, I'm so bad at this. Of the social contract, where the reason we like laws and civilization, and the reason we're able to give up the essential freedom to do literally anything, as long as it's in our self-interest, to find our own food and to defend our own lands and to choose our own mates. The reason we're willing to give that stuff up, even to a governmental system that's very, very terrible, is that in the state of nature we inevitably descend into the war of all against all, and so that's what's being depicted here. Also, there's an epistemological reading that talks about the mind being a war of all against all, and notice the mistake he makes is important. He starts out by saying this is a battle between two forces. I don't know, like some people might think of partisanship, or you might think of like the Hegelian dialectic. If someone like me, who only knows one thing about Hegel, knows about the Hegelian dialectic, where you have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and Crowley says in Duty, which is not exactly the same, but that you want to bring out saliently the difference between two points of view by fighting. And so you think of this as being, maybe Republican Democrat, or right left, or conservative versus revolutionary, or fascist versus communist, or something like that. Even those are both communal solutions to the civic problem. Communist, I want to say, solutions to the social problem. And so Hegel's formulation is different, because thesis and antithesis should form a synthesis, whereas all Crowley wants to do is bring out saliently the difference between the 2 points of view, and I think that's important. But here, that's a mistake. Really, there are an infinite number of points of view, and they're all trying to defend themselves. And this is true in society as it is in the individual. Your individual thoughts are individual point events, not organized forces. And the reason the least fortunate are those in the chariots is because these prominent thoughts that seem to be the most committed. For example, you might just love a political figure and think they're the bee's knees and shout from the rooftops about how this political figure should be the next king of outer space. But as soon as that guy is caught doing a line of cocaine off of the back of a transsexual prostitute, you start to question some of his policy-making abilities. Even though his sexual proclivities and his addiction to drugs have probably no bearing on his ability to make policy, but that's going to be enough to shake your faith. So these things that are prominent ideas are very, very fragile, whereas the underlying things that hide beneath the surface, the soldiers who are on foot, or pikemen or something like this, the values and subtle biases that informed your choice of that person as a appropriate candidate in the first place, those are going to be much, much harder to even identify, much less destroy. And those values are not an organized, consistent system. They are disparate. So that's why we discover only in the second of these paragraphs that it's a melee, not a battle. And in the midst of the battlefield there is a great tree, like the chinar tree, yet it bears fruit. And now all the warriors are dead, and they are ripe fruits that are fallen, and the ground is covered with them. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about the identity of fruits and people. When we talk about the harvest of the earth in the Revelation, it's important for our understanding of Liber 418. And then there is a laugh in my right ear. This is the tree of life. Notice, is the tree of life. Not man in the condition of the fall, or not the garden now that men have been expelled, or not the state of nature, but is. A is A. This battle just is the tree of life. So if we think we're living in an organized civilization where the state has the power to manage our affairs for us, and justice is in the hands of an organized group of rational, impartial, no, we continue to live always in the state of nature. Always life is just a war of all against all, and we don't want to lie to ourselves about that. No, we do want to lie to ourselves about that, but the angel is telling us that we can't meaningfully. You are always responsible for defending your own interests. Period. And now there is a mighty god, Sebek, with the head of a crocodile. His head is gray like river mud, and his jaws fill the whole air, and he crunches up the whole tree and the ground and everything. So this, being the tree of life, is the whole picture, the first 2 pages of this Aether, the whole picture of Eden from beginning to end. And so I can prove that by reading Genesis 1:1 through 1:8. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, and that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. Think of those first 2 or 3 paragraphs of this Aether where we start with a spider web, maybe ripples on the surface of the water, the way they weave around themselves. And then you have the black cross, and then the slightly smaller golden cross, and the light comes into the Aether. This might be a little thin, because many of the Aethers start with darkness and then develop into a little narrative. That's just part of the way receiving these kinds of visions work, is you need to start by getting down at least to Pratyahara, kind of a basic hum, and then the thoughts seem to bubble up on their own when you do scrying work. But given what happens in the rest of this section that I read, I think it's a valid interpretation. The next thing we read is Genesis 2:9. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, and the tree of life also in the middle of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Notice this, that the tree of life is in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There are two trees. Doth is a Sephiroth, but it's not on the tree of life. There are two trees. And then here, later on, Genesis 2:17 and 18. But the tree of knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For the day that thou eatest of that tree, for the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. And the Lord said, it was not good that man should be alone, and I will make him a helpmate. And then 3:24. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword which turneth every way to keep it the way of the tree of life. A flaming sword, think of the swastika and the hammer of Thor, and remember the alphabet of daggers, being the marcation at the gate of this Aether. It's an alphabet of daggers, a flaming sword. And the cherubim, remember in the Aether, we have the hermit with his lamp guarding the gate of the Aether, and also the green dragon. And of course, the section about planting the tree is just to remind us that the Chenna tree, yet it bears fruit, and the helpmate, all these, Eden being populated is what's important. I mean, when we talk about the war of all against all. Now we want to go to page 76. Paragraph 1. This is the 13th Aether. Into the stone there cometh an image of shining waters, glistening in the sun. Unfathomable is their beauty, for they are limpid, and the floor is gold, yet the sense thereof is of fullness. Paragraph 2. And an angel cometh forth of pure gold, walking upon this water. Above his head is a rainbow, and the water foams beneath his feet. And he saith, Before his face I am come, as he that hath the 33 thunders of increase in his hands. And from the golden water shalt thou gather corn. Then I'm to read page 77, paragraph 7, all the way to 78, paragraph 4. Then he saith, No man hath beheld the face of my Father. Therefore he that hath beheld it is called Nemo. And know thou that every man is called Nemo, that every man that is called Nemoth hath a garden that he tendeth, and every garden that is and flourisheth hath been prepared from the desert by Nemo, watered with the waters that were called death. And I say unto him, to what end is this garden prepared? And he saith, first for the beauty and the delight thereof, and next because it is written, and Tetragrammaton Elohim planted a garden eastward in Eden. And lastly, because, though every flower bringeth forth a maiden, yet there is one flower that shall bringeth forth a man-child, and his name shall be called Nemo, and when he beholdeth the face of my Father. And he that tendeth the garden shall seek not to single out the flower that shall be Nemo, he doth not but tend the garden. And I said, Pleasant indeed is the garden, and light is the toiling of tending it, and great is the reward. But he saith, Bethink thee that Nemo hath beheld the face of my Father. In him is only peace. And so, of course, the garden is the Garden of Eden, which, as we've already seen, is a tumult, melee, the war of all against all, and it is the responsibility of Nemo, the master of the temple, to tend the garden. We think about Adam naming all of the fruits and plants and birds and animals, you know, and the cat he called cat, and the dog he called dog, and the donkey he called donkey. And my joke I always tell is, now isn't that lucky? But you see that the responsibility of Adam right from the very beginning was to organize the phylum of creation, just like Nemo and Adam, of course, had beheld the face of God. He resided with God in the garden. Part of Adam's curse. Let's even read it. I think I might have written down to read it later, but let's read it now. Genesis 3:17. And unto Adam, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake, in sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. And in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou returneth unto the ground. So the punishment is farming. The punishment for the fall of man, the curse upon Adam, is that he needs to do farming. And here, Nemo, the reward of the master of the temple, is that he gets to tend to the garden of the earth. I want to notice that, but the real thing that I wanted to read was Genesis 9:11 through 15. And I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of the flood, neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you, and every living creature that is with you for the perpetual generations. I do set my bow in the clouds, that it shall be a token of a covenant between me and the earth. It shall come to pass, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant which is between me and you, and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature in all flesh that is upon the earth. This, of course, is after the flood, the 40 days of rain or whatever it is, and Noah has found a little island whereupon he can land, and the waters are beginning to recede, and God speaks to Noah saying, that's it. The giants are gone. The Nephilim have been purged from the earth, is one interpretation, which I think is not strictly biblical, but it's a common thing you hear. And the equanimities are purged. So you're good. No more am I going to destroy every living man, woman, child on the face of the earth. We're going to do things in a piecemeal fashion from now on. Look at the first two paragraphs of this 8th year again. Into the stone cometh an image of shining waters glistening in the sun. Unfathomable is their beauty, for they are limpid, and the floor is gold. Yet the sense thereof is a fruitlessness. Fruitlessness, no life in the water. And an angel cometh forth of pure pale gold, walking upon the water, and above his head is a rainbow. Remember the bow in the clouds, that was the sign of God's covenant. So here, this 8th year, we're learning a little bit about the story of Moses. The destruction of the earth, the promise to no more destroy the earth, and the responsibility of man, specifically Nemo, specifically the master of the temple, to tend to the harvest of the earth, which, as we will learn in Revelation, means people. The fruit of the earth is its people. Yes, I was supposed to read Genesis 3:17 to 19. Yes, that's the curse upon Adam, which we've already discussed. There is some confusion here, because the tree of life is in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but God orders Eve not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So presumably she can eat of the tree of life that is in the midst of the garden. But later on, when the serpent is trying to tempt her to come and eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he says, what did God say? Did God not say that you could eat of any fruit in the garden? And she said, yes, we could eat of any fruit except the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, for if we eat that fruit, we shall surely die. It's not even what we understand as a legal principle. It's not like an edict from a king or something like that. It's good versus bad, not good versus evil. Nourishing food is good, poison is bad. And if you eat of the fruit of, God says, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then you shall surely die. It's poison. But Eve remembers it as being the tree that is in the midst of the garden. She thinks that's what she's not supposed to eat. And so she thinks the fruit of the tree of life is poison, but she's all mixed up because maybe she thinks the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the tree that's in the midst of the garden. It's very confusing in the King James translation. I gather it's confusing in the original Hebrew too. It's translated in a number of different ways. I mean, it's easy to understand how the tree of life could be poison, because if you have life, you die. There's a continuity of existence and a beginning and a middle and an end, and if we have a normal understanding of how time functions, then life is poisonous. But there's also kind of maybe an idiosyncratic reading that what Eve understands to be the problem, she's mistaken about it, right? Like, she thinks that she's not supposed to eat from the tree that is in the midst of the garden. The tree that is in the midst of the garden maybe is the tree of life, and the serpent is trying to tempt her to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So whether or not she actually trespasses against God's commandment is maybe a little bit unclear, although I think in the King James Version it is clear. But the idea that the original sin might just be believing that you had betrayed the edicts of God, even if you hadn't, right? Like, this understanding having the knowledge of good and evil. Remember Nietzsche's criticism here that good versus bad. Well, good food, nourishing food is good, and poison is bad. You want to have lots of nourishing food, but Nietzsche's going to say that in the context of a slave revolt, having lots of nourishing food is actually evil. And what is good is to sacrifice of the self and actually have less of the good things, because you're distributing them among the people that have not. So there's this internalized resentment that the masters have by believing that having an excess of good things makes them evil. And so this knowledge of good and evil here is the original sin that causes the fall of man. And I think that's maybe a helpful interpretation for Thelemites. Although it was stronger when I misunderstood the text yesterday, so I might have to expunge that altogether for my interpretation on a couple more reads. The next thing that I am meant to read is from the 7th Aether, page 'No, you know what? I'm going to read one more thing from the 13th Aether, if I can find it. From page 79 in my version. So we enter the earth, and there is a veiled figure in absolute darkness. Yet it is perfectly possible to see in it, so that the minutest details do not escape us. And upon the root of one flower he pours acid, so that the root writhes as if in torture, and on another he cuts, and it shrinks like the shriek of a another he cuts, and the shriek is like the shriek of a mandrake torn up by the roots, and another he chars with fire, and another he anoints with oil. And I say, heavy is the labor, but great indeed is the reward. And the young man answers me, he shall not see the reward. He tendeth the garden. So two things. All these plants bring forth women, and only one man that will become the next master of the temple, the next Nemo. And the second thing is that actually tending the garden is not light labor, as he previously said. It means burying the roots with acid, or cutting the flower, or which shrieks like a mandrake, or charring with fire, or anointing with oil. It's like keeping a bonsai tree alive. You know, you're restricting its and manipulating and controlling its growth. You want it to be small, so that it's a bonsai tree, so that it exemplifies the nature of the thing that you're trying to accomplish. You don't, but that keeping it healthy under those extremely strict conditions is difficult. You need to do a lot of careful work to nourish it. But also, I'm sure the tree doesn't like being clipped and bitten and cut and molded. So, and on a careful reading of this, he's not just tearing out the weeds. He's not just murdering the bad plants, although I'm sure that's part of it. He's also chastising good students. Like, these are cool plants. but they require a lot of strict control and, you know, a lot more stick than carrot to get them to develop properly. And you do this. You set forest fires on purpose to clear out the weeds and the brush. You need to cut roses back quite harshly in order for them to flower properly at the right part of the year, which is part of the reason that maybe that's associated with our Tefereth symbolism. So on and on and on. But again, this is the alternative is the flood. So when God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah, he's being Nemo, right? He's being a harsh teacher of man, which is part of the responsibility of the master of the temple. This is the first place where we see a positive picture. I mean, most of the book talks about just don't think, don't exist, shut down, don't listen to Choronzon, dissolve yourself completely into the cup of Babylon. There's the thing in the book of the law where for one kiss wilt thou then be willing to give all, and whoso giveth one particle of dust shall lose all in that hour. Most of the book is about oblivion, and this is the first Aether where we see a more positive picture, not in terms of positive good and evil, but in terms of active and passive, a picture of what the master of the temple is actually tasked to do. And it's cultivate the harvest of the earth. Page 119. Paragraph 4. Oh, I see a vast plains beneath her feet, enormous deserts studded with great rocks, and I see little lonely souls running helplessly about, minute black creatures like men, and they keep up a very curious howling that I can compare to nothing I have ever heard, yet it is strangely human. You might think that these are the daughters of Lilith, or the incubi and succubi, or something like this, because of the description, blackened figures that howl and torment and stuff. Next, 120, paragraph 2. But they that are without understanding have interpreted all this askew, because of the mystery of the abyss. For there is no path from Bina unto Chesed, and therefore the course of the flaming sword was no more a current but a spark. And when the stooping dragon raised his head unto Daath, in the course of that spark there was, as it were, an explosion, and his head was blasted, and the ashes thereof were dispersed throughout the whole of the 10th Aether. For this all knowledge is piecemeal, and it is of no value unless it be coordinated by the understanding. I'm not sure that's what I was supposed to read, but it does speak more about the wounding on the head, and talks a little bit about why that might be saving the world. It actually is the moment of the lightning flash when the tree of life and everything that is in creation comes into being. Let's go above that. And the garden is the supernal Eden, where Ayin 70 is the eye of the concealed one, and the creative lingam, and Dalath love, and Nun the serpent, and therefore this constitution was implicitly the nature of Eden, so that the call of the Aethers could not have been any other call than what it is. I'm confused by my notes here. What I'm looking for is something to do with love. be this. And the voices said, These are they that grasped love and clung thereto, praying ever at the knees of the great goddess. These are they that have shut themselves up in the fortresses of love. That sounds more like it. Look, the point is that these black people are not the daughters of Lilith. They are the children of Eve. And so let's look back at our reading from Genesis here, Genesis 3:16. Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children, and they that desire shall be to thy Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. So that's the curse. It's not a virtuous position. The curse is that in sorrow she shall bring forth children, that her labor shall be painful, and that her desire shall be ever toward her husband. Here we have in, the second millennium before Christ, or something like this, the summation of the feminist critique, that women don't have projects, they have men instead, that they are not subjectified, they are in fact objectified in the service of men, and the desire is to their husbands. And in Liber 418, before the writing of Second Sex, the Simone de Beauvoir piece, it says here, These are they that grasped love and clung thereto, praying ever at the knees of the great goddess, and these are they that have shut themselves up in a fortress of love. So the reason they cannot become masters of the temple is that they have shut up the blood in the body by committing to this love, let's say, the love of the husband. So there is a problem that it's a comfortable position to be kept and scary to take responsibility for yourself. So as Simone de Beauvoir says in Second Sex, not most of the problem maybe, but part of the problem of feminism is that a good section of cross-section of women don't want to be liberated, or are scared to be liberated or something. They're happy, contented, at peace with the idea of housewifery and knowing the domain of responsibility. Anytime you go out from the world, this is why it's scary to quit your job too. But you have to be able to let everything go to develop in meditation. Let's look at page 124, paragraph 2 and 3. And a voice cries, Cursed be he that shall uncover the nakedness of the Most High, for he is drunkenness upon the wine that is the blood of the adepts. And Babylon hath lulled him to sleep upon her breast, and she that fled away and left him naked, she that hath called her children together, saying, Come up with me, and let us make a mock of the nakedness of the Most High. And the first of the adepts covered his shame with a cloth, walking backwards, and was white. And the second of the adepts covered his shame with a cloth, walking sideways, and was yellow. And the third of the adepts made a mock of his nakedness, walking forwards, and was black. And these are the three great schools of magic, who are also the three magi that journeyed unto Bethlehem. And because thou hast not wisdom, thou shalt not know which school prevaileth, or if the three schools should not be one. For the black brother lift up not their heads thus far unto the holy Chokmah, for they were all drowned in the great flood, which is Binah, before the true vine could be planted upon the holy hill of Zion. And the reference here is to Genesis 9, 18:27. Again, we are jumping around a little bit, but we are after the flood. And the sons of Noah went forth from the ark, were Shem and Ham and Japheth. And Ham is the father of Canaan. And these are the 3 sons of Noah, and of them was the whole of the earth overspread. And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within the tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his 2 brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took their garments and laid it upon both their shoulders, and walked backwards, and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brothers. And he said, Blessed is the Lord, the God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. And he enlarged Japheth, that he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. So, So Ham is cast out, and his son Canaan is made a servant to the other 2. And here, if you want to understand further this stuff about the 3 schools of magic, it's in Magic Without Tears. But the references to the nakedness of the father, I mean, it's weird because it's Ham who knew that the father was naked and that he needed help. So he sort of transgressed by accident, but he's still cursed because of the accidental transgression. And notice here, Noah, after the flood, becomes a gardener, just like the gardener Nemo, and he has to be hard upon his children, just like the gardener Nemo has to be hard on the plants of the garden. And even though, seeing his father's nakedness was a mistake, he still has to be cast out from civilization, and his son has to be made sort of put in a serving position of the other 2. And these are the 3 adepts of the white, the black, and the yellow school, and also the 3 magi that go to see Christ, it says in Luke 4:18. There's a further version of this for Lot. Abraham's son Lot, I think. After Lot's wife is stricken into a pillar of salt, which we've already talked about, he doesn't have any male heirs, and there's no one with whom he can produce male heirs, so his 2 daughters take turns getting him drunk on purpose. And one night one daughter goes to him, and the next night the next daughter goes to him. And so the heirs of Lot are produced by the daughters raping him. There's another version of this story of the Most High being drunken and the progeny coming to look upon him that is a little bit more manipulative and taken as being for good ends. This is just thing that happens with Noah is just a silly little mistake, and it has dire consequences. Whereas what happens with Lot and his daughters is much more grave, and I'm not aware of any consequences that come from that. So except perhaps that Lot maybe gets an heir or something. I don't know. We're at an hour now. I don't know. I don't think I have much more to do. Yeah, the next thing is the second Aether in my edition, page 148 and 149. And it's fairly self-explanatory, so one can just read it and understand. In the first place, there is again a woman riding on the bull, which is the reflection of Babylon that rideth upon the beast. And also there is an Assyrian legend of a woman with a fish, and also there is the legend of Eve and the serpent, for Cain was the child of Eve and the serpent, and not Eve and Adam. And therefore, when he had slain his brother, who was the first murderer, having sacrificed a living thing to his demon, had Cain the mark upon his brow, which is the mark of the beast spoken of in the Apocalypse, and it is a sign of initiation. The shedding of blood is necessary, for God did not hear the children of Eve until blood was shed. And that is external religion. But Cain spake not with God, nor had the mark of initiation upon his brow, so that he was shunned of all men until he had shed blood. And this blood was the blood of his brother. This is the mystery of the sixth key of the tarot, which ought not to be called the lovers, but the brothers. And then it describes the tarot card. But of course the reference here is to the first murder. Here it says Abel is the first murderer, not Cain, because Abel sacrificed a sheep to God. And then that Cain was not seen because he sacrificed wheat. And that when he did kill his brother, then he was seen. And the reference here is to Genesis 4:1 through 17. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again beareth his brother Abel, and Abel was the keeper of sheep, but Cain was the tiller of the ground. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought the fruit of the ground as an offering to the Lord, and Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock for the fat of 3 thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel's and his offering, but unto Cain and his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth? Why is thy countenance fallen? If thou dost well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou dost not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. And Cain talked with Abel, his brother. And it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up and slew Abel, his brother. And he said, I know not. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood cries up to me from the ground. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. And when thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be on the earth. And Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out of this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, and it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, Therefore, whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. And Cain went forth from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch. And he builded a city, and called it the name of the city after his son, Enoch. Have we read the curses on Adam yet? Maybe we should. They're short. It just says, And unto Adam he said, Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns and thistles also shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, and thou shalt return to the ground, for out of it wast thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. In Liber 4:18, we see that Cain is rewarded for killing his brother. Only when Cain sheds blood does God see him. And Cain receives the mark of the beast for his troubles, and the relationship with God is initiated by that transaction. God does not have respect for Cain's offering of vegetation, and Cain isn't seen. And we see on and on throughout the Torah how blood offerings and burnt offerings are demanded for the Feast of the Passover and for other festivals. So, but look at the curses in the Old Testament. Adam is cursed. He's forced to farm, and he's obliged to die. You know, in sweat shall thou eat of the harvest of the earth, or something like this. And then since from dust thou came, to dust thou shalt return. Those are curses. And then Cain is told, you can't farm. And Cain says, oh, no, if I can't farm, people are going to think I'm a monster. They're going to try to stone me to death or some shit. And God says, well, then you get to live forever. Here's the mark of the beast. Cain's curses are antidotes to Adam's curses. So this interpretation of Crowley's is a biblical interpretation, that what Cain actually did and what he received were rewards for his behavior. I'm going to leave it there because that's all the readings that I wanted to do. Man, I'm tired. Thanks for sticking with me for an hour and 7 minutes. And the next time we'll talk about the relationship between Liber Foraitine and the revelation of Christ to John the Divine, which is the apocalypse of the King James Bible. And it's probably going to take even longer than this. So I can't wait.